To implement validation, we're going to use a popular library called Yup. There's another popular library called Joy. I talked about that in my React and Node courses. But the reason we're using Yup in this course is that Formic has built-in support for data validation with Yup. Let me show you. So let's install Yup. Okay, so the version I'm using is 0.28.5. Now, in our login screen on the top, let's import everything as Yup from Yup. Okay, now outside of our function component, we're going to define a validation schema, an object that determines all the rules for validating our form. So let's define a constant called validation schema. And by the way, the reason I'm defining this outside of our function component is that we don't want this object to be redefined every time our function gets re-rendered. So here we use Yup. Yup has a few different methods for validating different types of objects. For example, we have the string method, we have number, we have object, and so on. So here we call the object method and then call the shape method to define the shape of this object. So here we pass an object, and in this object, we add the properties that represent our input fields. So we have this email field. Now, here we use yup.string because this is a string field. This should be required. So here we call the required method. Now, this should also be an email. It should be a valid email address. So with this method, we don't have to write a regular expression to validate the email field. We can chain these validation methods to build a complex schema. This is the beauty of Yup and Joy. So here we can optionally call the label method as well, because the name of this field is email with a lowercase e. But when displaying validation errors, I want to use an uppercase e. So this is why we use the label method. Now let's define the rules for our password field. So password is also a string. It's required. And let's say it should be at least 4 characters. Here we also have the max method. We have matches, so we can match this against a regular expression. You can read about this method on the Yup documentation. So let's give this a label as well. We're going to use password with a capital P. Here's our validation schema. Now, all we have to do is to set the validation schema prop to the schema we define. Formic takes care of everything for us. So finally, we have to display validation messages. So right after this input field, I'm going to add an app text. Auto import is not working, so let's import it on the top. Import app text from, we go up to components and load this module. Back to our validation message. So here's our app text. Now, how do we get the error? Well, earlier we talked about these 2 properties, handle change and handle submit. There is another property we can pick called errors. This is an object that contains all the errors in our form. For every field, we have a key value pair. So using this, we can render the errors for the email field. As simple as that. Now, here I'm going to apply an inline style as a temporary solution. I want to set the color of the validation error to red. Later, we'll refactor this and put this inside a reusable component. For now, let's not worry about it. Now, to save time, I'm going to copy this line and paste it after our password field. So here we want to display the errors for the password field. Now let's test our app. So here's our login form. If I press the login button, look, we have the validation messages. Now, the moment I start typing, this validation message gets updated. So if I type A, because A is not a valid email, we get a different error. Email must be a valid email. And note that email is spelled with a capital E. This is because of the label that we assign. So I'm going to set this to programming.with.mosh@gmail.com. Now the error is gone. So for the password field, if I type just 1 character, we get a different error. Password must be at least 4 characters. So as you see, validation with Formic and Yup is super easy.